It was just another normal night, and I was in my usual routine on duty when I got a call that sounded like just another common case. The woman who called sounded agitated, but not panicked. She said she was hearing strange noises coming from the closet in her bedroom, but was too scared to check on it alone. When I got there, she looked visibly relieved but still nervous. She explained that she lived alone and had never felt anything strange in the house until that night. That in itself already made me a bit suspicious, but it still seemed like a simple situation. I decided to do a quick inspection, going through each room to make sure everything was in order. The house was silent, and I didn't find anything unusual. But when I got to the bedroom, I noticed the closet door was locked from the outside with a padlock, which was strange. I asked if she'd done that, but she said no, claiming she'd never put a padlock there. That was odd, but I went on with the check. When I finally managed to force the door open, all I found was some clothes and a strong musty smell, like it had been trapped in there for a long time. Just as she showed me the message, a chill ran down my spine. I asked if there was anyone who might have been messing with her phone or trying to prank her, but she looked as confused as I was. The phone had been on the bed the whole time, and she'd been with me since I'd walked in. None of it made any sense. I decided to check her message history to see if there was anything strange, but there was nothing. It was like the message had just appeared out of nowhere, and it gave me the feeling that we were being watched. While I was trying to figure out what was going on, I heard a click. I looked at the closet, and I swear my heart nearly stopped. The door was locked again, but this time, from the inside. There was no way that could be possible. I had just opened it and left it wide open, and there was nobody in the room except the two of us. Sarah was already pale, her eyes wide with fear. She took a step back, trembling, and at that moment, I felt the fear too. Something wasn't right there, and it seemed to go beyond any logical explanation. With my heart racing, I tried to stay calm and asked Sarah to step out into the hallway while I investigated further. She went out, but was clearly reluctant to leave me alone in the room. I approached the closet slowly, analyzing every detail. This time, I tried pulling the door harder, but it was firmly locked. I remembered the musty smell, which was now even stronger, as if it was seeping through the cracks in the door. I tried peeking through the keyhole, but all I could see was total darkness. It was as if there was something there, but invisible. The air in the room was so heavy that it felt like the temperature had dropped suddenly. After a few minutes of trying to make sense of what was going on, I decided to call Sarah back and suggested she spend the night somewhere else, maybe at a friend or relative's house. She agreed without hesitation. She quickly grabbed a few things, and as we made our way out, I heard one last noise from the bedroom, like a muffled laugh or a heavy breath. I stopped and looked back, but there was nothing there. Sarah was about to say something, but she seemed frozen, like she was feeling exactly what I was feeling, that paralyzing fear you can't explain. We left the house without looking back, and as I helped her lock the door, I still felt like we were being watched. Once we were out of the house, I grabbed my radio and called for backup. I explained the situation quickly, trying to keep my voice steady, but the tone probably gave away that I was shaken. I knew the story would sound strange, maybe even funny, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off inside that house. It wasn't just a suspicion. It was like the house itself was pushing us out. Sarah was beside me, hugging herself, and I could see on her face that the idea of going back in alone was simply unthinkable. In less than 10 minutes, another officer arrived. I explained the situation to him, trying to be as straightforward as possible, but I knew my words didn't fully capture what had just happened. Still, he agreed to check the closet with me. We went back inside the house, and the musty smell was even stronger, almost unbearable. When we reached the bedroom, the closet door was slightly open, as if it was waiting for us. My partner looked at me, a little skeptical, but I noticed he also became more serious, maybe sensing the same thing I had before. We were dealing with something that went beyond our usual experience. We entered the room cautiously, and my partner took the lead, holding his flashlight steady with one hand and his other hand on his gun. I stayed close behind, alert for any movement. When he opened the closet door, the musty smell hit us again, but even stronger this time, as if the air had become thick and hard to breathe. Inside the closet, in the middle of the piled clothes, there was an empty space. and before I could react, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, hooded, with a blank look in his eyes and a gun pointed directly at us. Everything happened way too fast. I heard a shot and saw my partner get hit in the shoulder, falling back with a shout of pain. Adrenaline kicked in, and I reflexively drew my weapon and fired at the intruder. He tried to react, but the shot hit him right in the chest, and he collapsed without making a sound. The room fell into a dead silence, broken only by my partner's labored breathing and the muffled sound of my own breaths. I bent down to help my partner, still dazed but relieved that it was over. After the intruder fell, I managed to call for emergency backup and an ambulance for my partner. As we waited, the air in that house felt even heavier, like the danger was still lurking, even with the man down. I couldn't stop thinking about how he'd gotten in and how long he'd been hiding there, waiting for who knows how long. When the paramedics arrived, they took my partner to the hospital, and other officers started combing through the whole house, looking for any clues. Sarah was in shock. While we finished securing the scene, she told me she'd lived there for years and had never seen anything strange until that day. The only thing that stuck with her was the message on her phone, which felt more like a warning than anything else. Nobody ever figured out how he'd sent that message from her own number or why he chose the closet as his hiding spot. But fortunately, no one besides my partner got hurt. The house was cleared out that day, and Sarah never went back. I couldn't get that story out of my mind either. The intruder? They never found any clues about who he was or why he'd been there. But to this day, whenever I remember that message, "Don't open the closet," I get a chill. I've been a cop for over a decade, so I've seen it all. Robberies, family fights, strange cases, you name it. But there's one case that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It was a cold winter night, probably about 10 years ago. I was working the night shift when I got a call about a missing elderly woman. The neighbors had mentioned that no one had seen her in weeks, and her house was unusually quiet. I figured it was a typical case, maybe an accident or something, but I had no idea what I was about to walk into. I got there alone since it was just a welfare check case. The house was in an old neighborhood, one of those areas where every building seems to be from another time, kind of forgotten by the world. When I stepped inside, I was surprised by how spotless everything was. Every piece of furniture, every object, it all seemed like it had just been tidied up. But then I noticed something odd. The walls were lined with photos. Not family photos like you might expect, but all of them were pictures of the same child. A boy or a girl, I couldn't tell, because they were always shown from the side, either playing or looking down while wearing a carnival mask. I kept going, looking at each photo and noticing how unsettling they seemed. It wasn't just the number of them, but the way they were arranged. Black and white photos, all in old frames with small decorative details along the edges, and each one seemed to have been polished with great care. It was clear that the woman had spent a lot of time maintaining this. I still couldn't figure out why someone would have so many photos of a child, especially a woman who, according to the records, had lived alone for years and had no known relatives. It felt like I was being watched, but with the house empty, it didn't make sense. Or at least that's what I thought. When I reached her bedroom, it was like the air grew heavier. The room was just as meticulously organized, almost obsessively so. The bed was perfectly made, with a blanket pulled over something that seemed centered. I thought maybe I'd found the old woman, covered up and lifeless. But when I pulled back the blanket, my breath caught in my throat. Underneath the fabric, there was no body, but a handmade doll. The doll was shaped like an elderly person, with stitched eyes and a crooked smile made of thread, as if it was mocking me. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the doll. I didn't know what to do, whether to call forensics or report something strange, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The doll felt wrong. It was odd enough to make me feel like something was terribly out of place, but still, nothing physically threatening. Even so, I began to feel a chill run down my spine. Then, just to make sure my senses weren't playing tricks on me, I turned my head and looked back at the photos that covered the walls of the room. That's when I realized something had changed. Each of them now had the child's face crossed out, with strong, chaotic lines, as if someone had taken a marker and drawn harsh marks over the faces. My heart started racing. This wasn't right. There was no explanation for it. How could something that was there before, something so simple and straightforward, suddenly change right before my eyes? How had I not noticed this earlier? I rummaged through the rest of the room, searching every corner, trying to understand what the hell was going on, but all I found were more dolls. One here, another there, arranged in a way that seemed intentional, like they were watching every move I made. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to check her records. After all, something had to explain this. The strangest part was finding out that she never had children, grandchildren, or even any close relatives on record. She had lived there, alone, for decades. That's when a feeling of panic started to consume me. The pieces were all out of place, and the more I looked into it, the more everything seemed like a twisted joke. Every photo crossed out, every doll staring at me with those stitched eyes. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I went back to the living room and started going through her papers. I didn't find much, just a few old letters, but one of them caught my eye. It was an envelope with her name written hastily, like it was urgent. Inside was a simple letter with barely legible writing. But what really made me gulp was the last line. "He's coming back and I can't hide him anymore." The letter didn't make any sense, and it had no date or return address. I felt like an idiot, but at the same time, I knew there was something there I couldn't ignore. I decided to take one last look at the photos, and that's when I noticed something that almost made me fall to the ground. Among all the pictures of the child, there was one that was different. It was a photo of the old woman, tucked away in a corner of the wall, almost hidden by the others. But there she was. Somehow, she was in the picture, with that crooked smile and eyes that seemed alive. It was like she had been the child in those photos. But more than that, it was like she was watching me. That feeling of being watched was consuming me in a way I had never felt before. I tried to rationalize it, but it seemed impossible. How could I leave that house? It was like the entire place was closing in on me, swallowing me whole, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I finally decided to leave, something else happened. One of the dolls, the one closest to the door, seemed to have been moved. It was facing the entrance, like it was waiting for me. My heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be, right? I was getting paranoid. But, on impulse, I walked up to it and, when I touched it, the sound of the door slamming shut by itself almost made me jump out of my skin. The house was dead silent, but the sound echoed in my ears like a gust of wind. When I turned to leave for good, something in the mirror in the living room made me stop in my tracks. It was a reflection I hadn't noticed before. In the image, I wasn't alone. There was a shadowy figure of an elderly woman standing next to me, her head slightly tilted, eyes fixed on me. My body froze. There was no one there, but in the mirror, she was. The feeling that something invisible was moving around me overtook me completely. I was at the door, about to leave, when I heard a low laugh coming from inside the house. It wasn't a normal laugh, but something distorted, like a child mimicking the voice of an old woman. I couldn't stay any longer. I ran out of the house and didn't look back. When I finally reached the street, I still felt like the house was watching me. I went straight to my car and started driving, too scared to look back. The phone rang, and my heart nearly stopped. On the other end of the line, a voice whispered, "She's with me now." I hung up immediately, but I didn't know what that meant. To this day, I never figured out what really happened in that house, but I know something supernatural was there. The disappearance of the old woman was listed as an unsolved case. She never appeared in any records, and the house was sold a few weeks later. I never set a foot on that street again. I'd been a cop for about 6 years, and by then, I'd seen it all: break-ins, chases, and even a few cases that left us with chills running down our spines. But nothing prepared me for what happened that strange afternoon. My partner, Morales, and I got called in to check out a report on a suspect with an outstanding warrant. This guy was no joke. The kind you wouldn't want to run into alone in a dark alley, if you get what I mean. We were given the location of this old, somewhat isolated house where he was supposedly hiding out. But when we got there, something just felt off in a way I can't quite explain. The door was left slightly open, like someone had left in a hurry or was maybe waiting for us. We went in slow, keeping the noise down. The place was so quiet that our footsteps seemed to echo through the empty hallway. But after a few seconds inside, I started hearing something from upstairs. It was like a whisper, so low and soft that I wondered if my mind was just playing tricks on me. Morales looked at me with that expression that said he'd heard it too. So we headed up the stairs with our hands on our guns, ready for anything. At the top, we found a dark, cold hallway. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawings I'd never seen before, like someone had spent days scribbling them. And the smell, it was this burnt candle scent mixed with something else I couldn't put my finger on. We split up to check each room down the hall. I went into the first one on the right, a small, empty room with nothing but a half-open window creaking in the wind. Everything was dusty, like no one had been there in a long time. Still, the air in there was so cold it almost felt suffocating, and I had this weird sense of being watched. I tried to stay calm, but that heavy silence and the constant whisper from deeper in the house had me on edge. Suddenly, Morales called me from the end of the hall. When I got over to him, he was standing in front of this tiny staircase leading up to the attic. It was a narrow, dusty staircase with fresh footprints, like someone had just gone up. Morales climbed first, and I followed, lighting the way with my flashlight. When we got up there, I was expecting to find the guy hiding, or at least some clue about where he'd gone. But the attic was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no boxes. Just an old rocking chair in the middle, slowly rocking back and forth, like someone had just gotten up. At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. There was no wind, no draft that could have made that chair move on its own. It was one of those moments where everything in you is screaming to run, but we stood there, trying to do our job and make sense of what we were looking at. As we watched the chair, something weird happened. The whispering we'd heard before got louder, like it was all around us. I looked over at Morales, and he looked as freaked out as I felt. He shined his flashlight into the dark corners of the attic, but there was nothing there. Nothing that could explain that sound. I tried to say it was probably just the wind, but even to me, my voice sounded weak and unconvincing. There was something there that didn't add up, something messing with our heads. We tried to shake off the feeling and left the attic, going back down the stairs with that uncomfortable sense that we were being watched, maybe even followed. When we got back to the hallway, that burnt candle smell was even stronger, like something had just been lit and then blown out. At the entrance, we were about ready to leave and head back to the car. But then I noticed something on the floor near the door. Fresh, muddy footprints with droplets of water still running down. The strange part was that these footprints started at the entrance and went down the middle of the street, where they just disappeared, like whoever it was had evaporated. I looked at Morales, waiting for him to say something, but he was just as shaken as I was. None of it made sense, especially since we knew nobody had come through the door while we were inside. But the footprints were there, right in front of us, challenging any logic we had. We got back in the car with that weird feeling stuck to us, like we just walked through a nightmare and hadn't quite left it behind. On the drive back to the station, neither of us said much. I was replaying everything in my mind, trying to piece it together, but nothing made sense. Who had drawn those symbols? Why was the attic empty, but with that chair moving? I kept going over it, looking for an answer. Morales was quiet, staring out the window, and I knew he was as lost as I was. The only thing that was clear was that something really strange had gone down in that house. But the weirdest part happened afterward. A few days later, the police found the guy we were looking for, but not how we'd expected. He was dead, buried in his own backyard. And here's the creepy part. The coroner said he'd been dead for at least a week, meaning when we were at that house, he'd already been buried. So who or what was in that house? The footprints, the whispers, the chair. It all pointed to something we couldn't see. I spent weeks with that question gnawing at me, to the point where I could barely sleep. Even now, when I think about it, I get that same chill, like something followed us from there and is still watching. After that, Morales and I made a silent pact never to talk about that day again. I eventually put in for a transfer, and a few months later, he retired. Whenever I think about that house and what we saw, I wonder if we left something behind, or if we brought something with us. To this day, I avoid that street, and every time I hear the soft creak of a rocking chair, I think of that empty attic and that whisper. calling to us for reasons I pray I'll never ever understand. I've been a cop for a good 12 years, and I've seen a lot in this job. Lost people, accidents, situations that make you question people's sanity. But what I saw that night, honestly, I've never been able to explain. It was a regular night shift, around 2 in the morning, and I was doing my rounds on a somewhat isolated road in a region where practically nobody passed by after dark. The road was one of those old ones, with several bridges and tight turns. That night, the sky was starless, the kind of darkness only broken by the lights of the patrol car. Everything seemed normal until I reached one of the oldest bridges along that stretch. From a distance, I saw a car parked right in the middle of the bridge, an odd sight at that hour. The engine was still running and the headlights were on, but there was no one there, at least as far as I could see. I slowed down, feeling suspicious, and approached carefully. With each foot I got closer, a strange feeling grew inside me, something I can only describe as a chill down my spine that got worse by the second. When I parked behind the car and got out of the patrol car, the first thing I noticed was some deep scratches on the bodywork. They were marks covering almost the entire side of the car, like something had tried to tear the vehicle open. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 scratches. There were multiple parallel marks, deep enough to leave the metal twisted. It made no sense at all. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the scratches, trying to understand what could have caused them. An animal, maybe? But no animal I knew of had the strength to do that kind of damage. I decided to get closer to the car and look through the window. That's when I saw a kid's jacket on the back seat, thrown there like it was tossed aside. What chilled me to the bone was that the jacket was stained with blood, right around the chest area. That shook me up, you know? It's not something you see every day. My heart was already racing, but I kept my cool, or at least tried to. Then, when I looked at the front seat, things got even worse. There was a human leg, severed, lying there as if it had been torn off in the most brutal way possible. My stomach turned right then. I've seen many crime scenes, but nothing as disturbing as this. While I was trying to process all this, an unexpected sound froze me in place. Footsteps. Fast footsteps, like someone was running across the bridge. But when I looked around, I couldn't see anything or anyone. The sound seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the concrete of the bridge in a strange, distorted way. I turned on my flashlight and started turning in circles, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. The place was empty, just me in that car with the scratches and that thing on the seat. My mind was racing. Thousands of possibilities flashed through my head, but none of them made sense. I decided it was better to call for backup, because this was far beyond a simple case. As soon as I grabbed the radio and requested support, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise. I felt like something was watching me, analyzing me. And even with the adrenaline pumping, a part of me wanted to leave and forget I'd seen any of this. The next few minutes felt endless, and I stood there, waiting for backup. The feeling that something was wrong only grew. When they finally arrived, they quickly assessed the situation. They noticed what I had seen, and the atmosphere became even tenser. The car belonged to an old homicide case, a couple who had been murdered months before, and the vehicle had been reported missing ever since. But what really unsettled us was that there was no record of who had been driving it. No fingerprints, nothing to tell us who could have parked it there. But the blood and that severed leg, that was impossible to ignore. Forensics took the jacket, the leg, and the car. I stood there, watching everything being taken away, and I felt something was still off. I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a hallucination or something I was imagining, but at the same time, a part of me wished it was just that, a nightmare. The backup left with the car, and before they left, one of the investigators mentioned something about no reasonable explanation for the situation. But the truth is, none of us knew how to explain what had happened there on that bridge that night. After the backup left and I was alone again, that silence surrounded me once more. The wind swept across the bridge, but it felt colder than before, and I felt like something was still watching me. I did one last check around, thinking maybe I was just tired or imagining things. As I was about to get back in the patrol car, the sound of footsteps started again, but this time it was clearer, like someone was coming straight at me. I felt a chill and decided it was best to leave. I started the engine and sped off, trying not to look back, but curiosity got the best of me. In a quick glance at the rearview mirror, I swear I saw a shadow crossing the bridge, but it wasn't in a human shape. It was something I just couldn't define. Back at the station, people were still talking about the case, but nobody seemed to really want to dig deeper into what happened that night. The car was analyzed, but no new leads appeared, and the scratches and severed leg remained unexplained. To this day, every time I pass that bridge, I feel the same chill. I've never gone back there at night, and nobody has found anything like that since. I know it's hard to believe, but this is the truth about what I saw that night. What happened to those people, or whatever left the car there, is a mystery that maybe we're better off not solving.